Hey, Chandler Bolt here, and in this video I want to walk you through how I decided to drop out of school. And really, this is a decision-making process that you can use for almost any decision. Now, before I start this video, I've got to give a disclaimer, and that's that I've talked to a lot of people where they asked me about how I decided to drop out of school, and they ended up dropping out of school. So just be warned that you might end up dropping out of school. And also, if you're a parent and you're watching this video and maybe your kid dropped out of school, or maybe they're considering it and they end up doing it, please don't hate me or please don't find me. Now, in all seriousness, let's walk through this actual decision. So I always said to myself, when I went to school, I said, hey, I'm here for the education, not for the degree. So as soon as I get the education that I need, and if my business becomes successful or any of those things, then I'll have no problem dropping out. Now, it's one thing to think that in your mind, it's another thing to actually do it. And I remember the day that kind of changed everything for me was when it was just after a conference, and I was talking to a friend, and he said, Chandler, when are you gonna drop out of school? As if it was this assumed thing that was just gonna happen. And I thought for a second, and I didn't really have a good answer for him. And so I thought about it, and I thought, well, okay, maybe I could double down and finish early. You know, that was kind of where my mind went to. But then I thought about that, and I said, well, that sounds really miserable. And I would be miserable throughout that process. So then the secondary question that I asked was, if it's not worth finishing early, is it worth finishing at all? And that's kind of sparked me down this whole decision-making process to where I started seriously considering dropping out of school. Now, I remember as I was in school, I was involved in all these extracurricular things. So I was a young life leader, played club tennis. I was a part of Student Painters. There's an internship where they teach you how to run a business. And those things took up a whole lot of my time. And I remember my mom would always call and she'd say, Chandler, why don't you stop doing some of these other things? Because you're gonna burn out, or you're gonna drive yourself crazy. And I said, Mom, I don't think you understand. These other things bring me life. School is sucking the life out of me, and these other things bring me life. So I went to school and I wanted to learn how to run a business. Now, I quickly discovered I was learning how to run a business from professors who had never ran a business, and that didn't make too much sense to me. And they were making me take all these prerequisites that had no value to my long-term goals and business aspirations. So this was kind of a frustrating process. So when the rubber met the road and I said, hey, this is actually a decision that I'm going to consider, there's two really important frameworks that I considered and that I think you need to consider, whether you're deciding whether or not to drop out of school, or these are just really great frameworks for just making any decision. Now, the first decision-making criteria, this is something I learned from Tim Ferriss, and I really love this framework. So here's what he says. You need to consider the best case scenario and the worst case scenario. Now, I know this sounds simple. Let me dive a layer deeper. What happens is most people overemphasize the worst case scenario. So for me, I'm thinking through, what is that worst case scenario? And the worst case scenario for me was I drop out of school, I try to start this business, the business totally fails. A year later, I have to come back to school, and now I'm a year behind all my friends, and I finish out my degree, and it's a year later. So in the grand scheme of life, scale of 1 to 10, this is probably a 2 or maybe a 3 out of 10 in terms of lifetime impact, right? Negative impact to my life in the grand scheme of things. So what Tim Ferriss talks about in this decision-making criteria is this is a temporary 2. Not only is it only a 2 or a 3, but it's reversible. I can just come back to school a year later. So there's no long-term serious damage that's been done here, right? Now, what about the flip side? What's the best case scenario? Well, the best case scenario is that my business takes off. The business does really well. And then now all of a sudden I haven't wasted 2 years of my life finishing out this degree, which I don't even need to be an entrepreneur. You don't need a degree to be an entrepreneur. So the best case is that my business does well. So in the grand scheme of life, that's a 9 or a 10, or maybe an 8 if we're being conservative. But this is a permanent 8. Like, my life will go off on a whole nother trajectory, right? It is just going to be totally different from that day on. So what he says, and what I think is so important that you capture here, is that most people give up on a permanent 8 because of the risk of a temporary 2. So when I sat down and kind of evaluated those, I said, all right, this is a temporary 2. I'm gonna take this risk, I'm gonna drop out. Now, I've got another video about the difference between taking risks and being risky, and I definitely recommend that you check that out. But this was a calculated risk that I was taking. Now, here's the thing. Anytime you make a decision that diverges from the cultural norm, you're gonna get a lot of feedback and oftentimes a lot of flack from people who don't agree with that decision. So I know for me personally, when I decided to drop out of school, I had people coming out of the woodworks that I hadn't heard of from years. I haven't heard from them in years. They're family friends. We hadn't talked, and they just getting on the phone with me to tell me, Chandler, you're making a bad decision. You're going to regret this. Stay in school. Right? So really, if you're making this decision, not only do you have to evaluate, what's the best case scenario, what's the worst case scenario, you have to be prepared to defend that. And really, in a lot of cases, not even defend it, you just say, I've made my decision, right? So that was kind of the first decision-making criteria. And maybe you've heard the Theodore Roosevelt quote, it's all about the man in the arena, and don't listen to flack from other people who aren't in the arena. So don't listen to negative opinions from people who maybe your view of the world is just different from theirs. A lot of times people will squelch your success and your goals just because it's a reflection of things that they think themselves that they could not achieve. So they're gonna cast their limited vision onto you in the process of making this decision, right? So, all right, let's rewind the track. Now we're going, okay, best case scenario, worst case scenario. That's a good starting point. Then I also looked at one other very important decision-making criteria, which that's opportunity cost. And really underneath that is sunk cost. So for some of you, I realize it might be just planes overhead, and I'm just speaking gibberish for those of you who have not been in an econ class, but we'll break this down. So opportunity cost says, what is the opportunity that I'm giving up to pursue this opportunity right now? So in my case, the opportunity cost for me was, everyone was telling me, Chandler, you got all these scholarships, you could finish your degree for $7,000 in tuition. You'd be crazy not to do that, right? So many people spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on their degree. You could finish yours for $7,000. Stay in school. Now, for me, I looked at the opportunity cost and I said, hey, I could probably make hundreds of thousands of dollars in those couple of years if my business does well, or worst case scenario, I'm gonna be way further down the line and on track to doing bigger and better things by the time that all of my friends are graduating. So I said, let me consider that opportunity cost, and then sunk cost. So a lot of it, this is another thing that you have to consider is, oh, I'm already 2 years into this, right? So there's sunk costs, which sunk cost fallacy says that people have a bias towards things that they've already spent money or time on. So I remember my econ teacher always explaining this concept. He said, imagine you paid $20 for a movie theater ticket, right? And then on the way into the movie theater, you realize that you've lost the ticket. Do you buy another ticket? Now, most people, the bias, sunk cost bias or sunk cost fallacy, they say, well, yes, because I already bought a ticket and I lost that ticket. But what he said is you need to reconsider the decision from scratch, from the starting point, and say, do I want to spend $20 to see this movie or not? Right? So that's sunk cost fallacy, and that's also opportunity cost. So for me, I'm looking at the opportunity cost of what would my time be worth outside of school. So those are all the things that I kind of decision-making criteria, so that I took that to mentors, I took that to people in my life that I valued their opinion, I prayed about it, I did all those things, and at the end of the day, I got a lot of advice that was, hey, Chandler, for most people, we wouldn't recommend this decision, but for you, we do. Right? So I was able to actually get real input and real advice from people who I value their opinion, but also I was very firm in why am I making this decision. So fast forward a few months, I made the decision, and here's what happened. Well, that opportunity cost was a real thing. By the time all of my friends graduated college, the year that my friends graduated, my business did 7 figures. We did $1.32 million in revenue that year, right? Or $1.32 million in sales. So the result of that is I've always felt like I had a 2-year head start. A 2-year head start on life and in learning all of these lessons because I made that contrarian decision to drop out of school. So whether or not you're deciding to drop out of school or whether you're just making a decision, I would encourage you to consider those 2 things. Number 1, what's the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario? Can I live with the worst case scenario, and is this temporary? And then number 2, consider opportunity cost. I know for me personally, at the time, it can feel like this crazy decision. No one agrees with the decision. I know there was a 6-month period where I felt like an idiot because every person I talked to, I'd have to say, oh, well, I'm a college dropout, but not like a loser dropout. Like I didn't flunk out of school, like I had good grades, but I'm doing this business, but the business hasn't really worked out yet, and all those things. So I felt like I needed to justify that. You don't need to justify it. Stay true to those criteria and make that decision. So I'd love to hear from you. I know this one might stir the pot, whether it's from parents, whether it's from people considering dropping out of school. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Have you used this decision-making criteria? Or when it comes to considering whether or not to drop out of school, what are you thinking? What are the questions that you're asking? Comment below this video, let me know, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. See ya.